Even though there are many antagonists throughout the Final Fantasy franchise who have been able to make a significant splash, there are few that have had the same level of impact as Chaos. Now, that might seem like a nonsensical statement when Chaos is placed alongside the likes of Kefka and Sephiroth, but if you look beyond their respective narrative involvement and permeation into popular culture, instead focusing on their influence within Final Fantasy itself, then it's a very different comparison. And that's because, unlike many of the other antagonists who have graced the Final Fantasy franchise, Chaos has continued to come back time and time again in a variety of forms. The most recent instance has gained quite a few headlines due to how driven and crazed Jack Garland seems to be about his desire to kill Chaos, and it's because of that desire that it felt appropriate to explore Chaos in a bit more detail ahead of the release of Stranger of Paradise. So strap yourselves in as we take a very granular dive into the complete evolution of Chaos.
Their nemesis, Chaos, awaits.
Chaos first appeared in the original Final Fantasy, where it served as the game's final boss and corrupted form of Garland, the main antagonist. Once a noble knight, Garland was seduced by power. This seduction created a sense of privilege within Garland, and he sought to create a time loop so that he might live forever. To aid with this plan, the four fiends were created. They would manifest following the fusion of Garland's hatred with the four elements of the world, and by being sent to the future, they would be responsible for sending Garland back into the past whenever he was defeated by his nemesis, the Warriors of Light, something that within the timeline represented within Final Fantasy I would happen in the Chaos Shrine. After being confronted in the past, Garland would then absorb the power of the four fiends to transform into Chaos, the ultimate manifestation of darkness. This provided a strong narrative setup, and it was here at this moment, right at the end of the game, that we would see some visual and mechanical traits, as Chaos had a very unorthodox design. Featuring a yellow body with purple accents, Chaos had two pronounced horns, two wings, and multiple heads, with a fifth head even being added on his head for the WonderSwan remake. And to represent the four fiends, during the final encounter, Chaos would have access to the game's top-tier elemental spells and elemental abilities. With hindsight though, it may all sound quite simple, but at the time, Garland's plight and the perilous journey the Warriors of Light undertook was riveting stuff, as was how these narrative concepts were incorporated into underlying gameplay mechanics. And outside of creating a long-standing focus on the conflict between light and dark that even spilled over into franchises that had a connection with the Final Fantasy franchise, it provided a surprising level of depth that would serve to inspire future creators who worked on the franchise to either recreate this specific version of Chaos or alternative forms of the demonic villain. But as Chaos was very specific to Final Fantasy I, just as had been the case with Emperor Mateus, Cloud of Darkness, and all the other prominent antagonists, there was no reason for it to ever reappear, at least in relation to that original form. Even still, when a being called Chaos was created for use within Final Fantasy VII, some traits were similar. Within the original version of Final Fantasy VII, Chaos had a very limited connection with the narrative, and that was because of its association with Vincent Valentine, an optional character who, to avoid being cut out right from the game, had significant portions of narrative development removed. Still, at least one thing did remain. Chaos would be the result of a somewhat regular individual being transformed into something demonic, and its power would be awesome by comparison. In this case, Chaos could be accessed by Vincent as his fourth and ultimate limit break, and just like the other forms available to Vincent, upon becoming Chaos, the player would lose control until the end of the encounter. The transformation into Chaos would also result in a visual change to Vincent, and although it may have been coincidental, the new appearance featured two wings, two horns, and purple accents, although the body was changed from yellow to a much darker colour. Not too long after, Final Fantasy Tactics would feature a brief allusion to Chaos. It would see the Shrine of Chaos appear as a wonder, but although some other wonders referred to specific characters such as Matoya, for this particular instance, neither Chaos or Garland were referenced, with the subject instead being known as Jade the Netherlord. A similar approach was then seen in Final Fantasy IX, as although Chaos did not appear, the traditional four fiends did, and in the Japanese version they were again referred to as the Four Chaoses. It would not be until Final Fantasy Unlimited that the role of Chaos would be expanded upon, And even though this was yet another version of Chaos, some traits were introduced that would muddy the waters for future iterations and bring them all closer together. Earl Tyrant served as the primary antagonist throughout what we got to see of Final Fantasy Unlimited before it was cancelled. But as had been seen in the two previous iterations, this would only be an initial form, as Earl Tyrant's true form was that of Chaos Tyrant, a bird-like demon with 2 wings and a heavy emphasis on the colour purple. Chaos's short-term objective was to spread death and destruction, but its wider objective was to try and harness the power of Omega. And throughout the series, viewers would bear witness to its numerous attempts. What's interesting is that when Dirge of Cerberus launched a few years later, some of what was just established within Final Fantasy Unlimited was incorporated into the wider lore of the compilation. With Vincent Valentine promoted to the role of protagonist, the scenario writers spent a lot of time building out his backstory, and this led to a lot more details relating to the origins of Chaos. Within the lore they established, it was said that Chaos was created by the planet to work in tandem with a mega weapon. Chaos, having manifested from tainted or corrupted lifestream, would channel negativity to wield a power capable of bringing about mass destruction. This wouldn't allow the lifestream to return to a single source ahead of Omega Weapon's imminent departure from the planet. This concept would see Chaos, via Omega Weapon, linked with the cycle of rebirth or immortality, much like the original Chaos, as the purpose of Omega Weapon leaving the planet would be to start anew. But beyond that, it also showed another instance where Chaos was born from corruption. The latter point was then further emphasized by the creation of Nero the Sable, the result of Shinra using tainted lifestream on soldiers within Deepground. Chaos itself would be accessible by Vincent during numerous points throughout the game, but the final chapter would be the main area of focus, and this would emphasize the modified design that would see red added to the color palette, with Chaos's design being integrated into Vincent's basic model. Final Fantasy XII deviated away from quite a few established norms within the Final Fantasy franchise, and one area where this was most pronounced was its summons. Referred to as espers, its roster featured none of the traditional summons that had become synonymous with the franchise, but that didn't stop the developers from including subtle nods to the past, as one of the espers was called Chaos, Walker of the Wind, a deity said to be trapped within a time loop. Appearing as one of the level 3 espers, Chaos was optional and could be obtained after overcoming a difficult encounter that took place in the Necrol of Nabudis, and it was during this encounter that the source of inspiration would become quite clear, especially in the original version of Final Fantasy XII. From a visual perspective, Chaos had 3 very pronounced horns, just as had been the case during the initial appearance on the Famicom, and its body was a mixture of yellow and blue in place of the traditional purple accents. There were no wings, but Chaos now wielded 4 swords. They were used to represent the 4 fiends, with their colours aligned to the original elements. Throughout the battle, due to its alignment with the wind element, Chaos would focus on using top-tier wind spells such as Eroga and Whirlwind, but when summoned, it would also use the other top-tier elemental spells as well as Tornado, harkening back to the original Chaos. However, when the Zodiac Cage released, the summoned version of Chaos was restricted to only using wind elemental magic. Chaos would then return in Revenant Wings, but its elemental affinity was changed to fire. However, there was an allusion back to its original roots, as defeating Chaos would unlock Kites' quickening called Nature's Wrath that would deal heavy mixed elemental damage. But for Tactics A2, instead of building upon Revenant Wings, Chaos reverted back to being a wind-based being, with its ultimate move being Tornado. The next major appearance of Chaos would come in Dissidia Final Fantasy. It would serve as a huge tribute to the original incarnation, but also went beyond, as this iteration of Chaos was its own unique entity. As had been seen before, Chaos was a result of corruption. Created as a sentient mannequin by Sid of the Lufane, Chaos was meant to be aligned with peaceful endeavours, but after the Onrak military learned of its combat applications, they seized Chaos and forced it to fight in their wars by threatening the life of Sid's wife. During its time in service of the Ornak military, Chaos would fight against numerous summoned beasts, including the powerful Omega, and they furthered their manipulation by cloning Sid's wife to create a mannequin called Cosmos. Watching from afar, Sid had become very concerned about how corrupted Chaos had started to become, but everything turned sour when a rescue was attempted and Sid's wife was shot and killed. Enraged, Chaos somehow opened a portal to the interdimensional rift, and it became stranded alongside Sid and Cosmos. In an attempt to find a way home, Sid made a pact with Shinryu. Chaos and Cosmos would fight until they could open up a rift again and find a way home, something that led to them being stuck in a time loop. And it was while stuck in this time loop that Chaos's descent would continue, as even though Chaos was once a kind and unwilling participant, as the cycles continued, its memories faded and Shinryu, with assistance from Garland, sowed further seeds of corruption and evil. It was quite a comprehensive tale that pulled from numerous sources to create something original, and that same notion was applied to Chaos's design, as it once again had 2 wings, 2 horns, and multiple heads with a yellow body and purple accents, but this time Chaos was given an extra set of arms. When Dissidia Duodecim was released some years later, the story of Chaos was further explored, and it led to the creation of Feral Chaos. Unlike Chaos, who was corrupted over time, Feral Chaos was more akin to the traditional manifestations of Chaos, as it was the evolved and even more corrupted form that sought nothing but death and destruction. This version of Chaos would then appear in Theatrhythm Final Fantasy. Its initial role would be that of main antagonist, but in subsequent games, Chaos would become a playable character. The next major iteration of Chaos would come in Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light. It would see Chaos positioned as the main antagonist, with its ultimate aim being to seek destruction. Harkening back to Final Fantasy Unlimited and Dirge of Cerberus, this iteration of Chaos would gain its strength from the suffering of the people, and when cornered, would transform into even more powerful iterations, with the third and final form being the Chaos of Time and Space, which would have a design that loosely incorporated elements seen before, including 4 arms. As the fight progressed, Chaos would evolve its magic usage. The first form would use dark elemental magic, but the second and third forms would use the suite of top-tier elemental spells, including Blaze, Earthquake, and Tsunami, as well as a move called Big Bang. For Final Fantasy XIII, the appearance of Chaos took a rather different turn, as instead of being a physical being, it was instead an energy. This concept had been seen numerous times before, with multiple properties referring to Chaos as a concept that was fueled by negativity, death, and destruction, but in each of those instances, there had always been a vessel. However, despite being referred to in Final Fantasy XIII, it wouldn't be until its sequel that there would be a manifestation, and that came in the form of Caius Ballard. Once a proud and noble warrior, Caius was saved by Etro and given the gift of immortality, but being stuck in the endless cycle of death and rebirth ended up being a curse that drove Caius to end the cycle so that he would be saved from the pain of having to watch Yule die endlessly. Part of this plan would see Caius unleash chaos on the world, and towards the conclusion of this particular part of the narrative, Caius even fused with Chaos to become Chaos Bahamut. And this accentuated the colour palette of Caius, which was very similar to that of Chaos in Final Fantasy VII, with a black body and purple accents. Final Fantasy Dimensions played with the established traits associated with Chaos, and this was seen across numerous aspects. From a narrative perspective, whereas Chaos had sometimes been a good individual corrupted by power, in the case of Elgo, there was no notion of him ever being good. Yet he deceived the Warriors of Light into believing that was the case, all the while plotting behind the scenes to work towards his ultimate goal of becoming immortal. When the truth became known, Elgo challenged the Warriors of Light and Darkness, but in the ensuing conflict, he ended up becoming Chaos Elgo, a grotesque figure capable of casting powerful spells, including Big Bang, a spell only just associated with Chaos in The Four Heroes of Light. Final Fantasy XIV has featured 2 interesting variants of Chaos in recent years. The first was quite faithful, and tied in with some of the wider traits such as the association with Omega. Having proved itself to be one of Omega's most successful creations, it would see Chaos appear as a boss during the Alphascape. And here, it would use numerous high-level elemental spells such as Tsunami, Earthquake, and Blaze, just like the original version of Chaos. But there were also some interesting additions, such as an ability called Big Bang, that had only just become associated with Chaos. A similar approach was taken to design, as Chaos featured 2 massive horns and multiple heads and had a yellow body just like in the original, but the purple accents were made very subtle and it was given 4 arms just like in Dissidia. The second interpretation of Chaos was a bit more subtle, and it built upon the association that exists with Ivalice. In Final Fantasy XII, Zodiac, known as the Keeper of Precepts, was the most powerful esper that could be obtained by the players, and unlike the other espers, each of which had a counterpart, Zodiac existed as the sole esper associated with darkness. In Final Fantasy XIV, Zodiac was considered to be the true god, and when its mask was shattered, it broke away to reveal an entity that bore a striking resemblance to the original version of Chaos.
At last, I am become Zodiac!
Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 pulled in numerous traits for its interpretation of chaos, and it did so to great effect, even pushing some of the boundaries. Despite Muti being one of the main protagonists, players learn that due to a noble sacrifice made in the past, Muti would also become the main antagonist, Chaos. In this corrupted form, Chaos would have generals, be stuck in a time loop, and would even take on a form seen only once before in Final Fantasy XIII-2, Chaos Bahamut. But it would go even further, creating a third corrupted version called Neo Chaos Bahamut. Similar to what's expected from Stranger of Paradise, Mobius Final Fantasy offered an alternative retelling of the story seen within the original game. It focused on the story of Wall, and the main antagonist was an individual called Chaos. Once a noble lord, Chaos became disillusioned with life after being rejected by Princess Sarah. It led to him undertaking heinous acts in order to blackmail her into marriage, but after being slain by Cid, Chaos lived on, becoming immortal due to the corruption and darkness that had consumed his heart. For this particular iteration, even though Chaos was created as a direct reference to the original main antagonist, the designers chose to distance themselves from the original design. It saw Chaos now appear as a futuristic entity with a metallic body, although purple accents were retained. But that was only a ruse ahead of the main event, as during its second phase, the true form of Chaos would emerge. It featured 4 arms, some giant horns, and even gained a yellowish sheen. The most recent iteration of Chaos came in Dissidia NT, although it was only a mere illusion, as opposed to a fully formed appearance of Chaos. After the conclusion of the previous timeline, Chaos was destroyed, but its soul survived, and it would eventually lead to the birth of Spiritus. And this new character would then appear in Opera Omnia. And that brings us on to Stranger of Paradise. At the moment, we have a pretty clear understanding that Chaos is the main antagonist, and that Jack Garland and his allies have a burning desire to defeat it. But so far, we're yet to gain an understanding of Chaos's role within the context of the narrative, how it will look from a visual perspective, and what moves will be carried forth. However, based on what the developers have said in the build-up, we can expect it to be a modern but faithful interpretation. Either way, from all of this, it's quite clear that Chaos has been a pretty important part of the Final Fantasy franchise. Despite appearing as an antagonist in the original game, there have been numerous iterations of Chaos that have appeared throughout the years, and these have implemented different aspects of narrative, design, and gameplay mechanics to create a whole host of different Chaoses that are all connected. Based on all of that, it feels like this was a rather compelling evolutionary study, and we hope that when Stranger of Paradise releases, it's added to even more. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider giving us a like, and as always, be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments. I also need to note that if you'd like to influence the types of evolutionary studies we produce in the future, make sure you check out our Patreon, as supporters get exclusive voting rights on upcoming evolution videos. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Anthony Hoffman, Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Ericus C. Deloriette, and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.